Okay, welcome back. And in this video, we're going to begin Chapter 9 of the Rathus text, the introductory psychology text. We're going to be covering one of my favorite chapters to cover. The chapter is titled The Voyage Through the Lifespan, but sometimes it's referred to simply as lifespan psychology or developmental psychology. But essentially, we are going to be looking at how we change from birth to death, and honestly what we're going to be looking at a little bit earlier than birth, kind of prenatal development as well. So we're going to be taking a journey from birth to death. We're going to be talking about some different themes related to everything that happens to us between birth and death. We're going to be looking at how our thinking changes, how our bodies change, all kinds of things change. Really, the theme of this chapter is impermanence. Lots of change going on. And so by the end of the chapter, you should have a pretty good idea about what's going on before, as far as development begins. We're talking about even in utero, development is occurring. There's a big debate about, like, when does life begin? Does it happen at conception? Does it happen at birth? That's fine. That's a debate for scholars and politicians alike and whomever. But really, as far as development is concerned, development begins in utero. Development begins at conception. So we can talk about that at least in terms of development. You're also going to look at, we're going to start off by looking at children, looking at different developmental stages. So we'll look at the physical development of children, cognitive, social, and emotional development of children. Then we'll move on and talk about adolescence, and then adulthood. And then finally, we'll apply some of these same ideas to adulthood. And also we can break up adulthood into several different stages as well. Emerging adulthood, adulthood, late adulthood, et cetera, et cetera. And then we'll cover death as well. So in order to proceed, let's just briefly review to make sure we're all on the right page. Briefly go ahead and describe and kind of explain what's going on with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So you can go ahead and pause the video. Maybe you want to jot some ideas down or some thoughts down. Okay, welcome back. Maybe you drew the hierarchy, the pyramid that Maslow wrote. It starts off with food, basic needs like food and water, and then we move up to safety and security. Then we have belongingness. Then we have self-esteem, and then finally that final stage, according to Maslow, we're all trying to reach is self-actualization, try to become the best version of ourselves, maximizing our potential. Here are the truth or fiction questions. You can take a look at these and go ahead and pause the video, maybe write your answers down now as we go along. Sorry, you can pause if you'd like. Sorry if I went too quickly. Okay, welcome back. Okay, so let's talk about life as it begins, at least in terms of development. We're talking about prenatal development, when babies are born, when a mother, biological mother and father come together and produce a child via, sexual reproduction, or obviously there are other ways that children are born, in vitro, all kinds of ways, artificial insemination, all kinds of ways that children are born. So either way, we're still talking about the same thing. But once that event has taken place, now we're talking about prenatal development. And that occurs in different stages, like everything else we're going to talk about in this chapter occurs in different stages. We have the germinal stage. This is the period of conception. This is when the sperm and egg are coming together. We have this implantation of the sperm and the egg. At this point, as far as our, what we have here, we have a zygote. It's just cells that are dividing rapidly and rapidly and rapidly. So that's all we can really see at this point. At this stage, you see a rapid collection and division and growth of cells. And eventually we get into the embryonic stage. This is about 8 weeks or so, about 2 months into pregnancy. And this is where you can actually start to see what looks to be a human child, albeit, it's not fully formed by 8 weeks by no means, but you can start to see signs. You can start to see things like head growth. You also can see some of the major organs developing, like the heart. So this is a really big moment. This is kind of the moment also that parents, may find out, oh, I'm pregnant, or they may go to the doctor and get their picture of the first picture of their baby or the heartbeat or something like that. And it's a really big moment for soon-to-be parents. The organs grow first, the extremities grow afterwards. We grow out, we grow inside out, so to speak, meaning like center out, not inside out. That sounds really weird. From the center out, and then from the head down. The termination of the biological gender of the child is determined by chromosomes, by the genetic code. Getting the two X's, or X and Y, determines if you're a biological male or female. The embryo at this stage is kind of hanging out in the amniotic sac, and this is providing fluid and sustenance and nutrients to the child. Everything that the mother eats is kind of passed along and exchanged from the mother to the embryo through the placenta wall. That's kind of keeping the barrier, keeping the child separate from the rest of the mother's body. And they're obviously connected via the umbilical cord. And so again, everything the mother eats or consumes goes through the umbilical cord, through the placenta to the child. After a certain amount of time, by about the third month or so, the child enters the fetal stage, and this is where you can actually begin to see the child move. The mother can physically feel the child moving. The child is becoming more mature physically in their development. They are starting to resemble like what you expect a baby to look like when they're born. They're getting bigger. You can see their appendages, their organs are developing. I mean, all kinds of magic is happening at this stage. They start to look like a baby. Okay, so just threw a few stages at you. Let's make sure we're on the same path before we move forward. The first 2 weeks after conception are referred to as A, the fetal period, B, germinal period, C, embryonic, or Z or D, zygotic period. Pause the video, write your answer down, come back when you think you have your answer. Okay, welcome back. You should have put B for the germinal period. This is conception all the way to the first couple of weeks. This is germinal period. This is where germination has taken place, sperm and egg, and where the cells are beginning to rapidly divide and grow. First true or fiction question. Your heart started beating when you were only 1/5 of an inch long and weighed a fraction of an ounce. What do you think? Pause the video. Write your answer down. Okay, welcome back. Your answer is in fact true. It is in fact true. This is when we start to see organ development. When you are very small, again, the organs start developing and working far before the body kind of starts to resemble what it's supposed to look like as far as the baby is concerned. Organs develop first, then the appendages. So here we have, we can see the different stages. In this picture on the left, you'd be looking more at the embryonic stage. We can see some of the organs develop. The head is becoming, developed and pronounced. Even the limbs are there, obviously, but not nearly to the same extent as we look over here in this other image in the fetal stage. This looks much more like a human baby, although it still has a lot more development to go. But we can see the changes from the embryonic to the fetal stage. Once the child is born, now we're getting into childhood, or obviously first infancy, which is the earliest stages of childhood. Starts off, children aren't, they're not born extremely capable of movement. They continue to develop after birth. That's the one thing about humans that's different from other mammals and other organisms, is that much of our development takes place outside of the womb. We don't come out ready to walk and talk. Those things take some time to develop. We are capable of some behaviors, some really simple reflexive behaviors, sucking, rooting, grabbing things, simple reflexes we're capable of when we're infants, but we have to learn the other things. We have to learn them progressively from simple acts. Children just don't start walking. They crawl first, or they roll over first, and then they crawl, and then they stand up, and then they walk. Part of that is because the brain is still maturing, and that takes time, and also experience. Children need development. They also need the experiences to kind of learn how to do these things. So here's a typical chart of kind of what you should kind of expect as far as like children's movement. I mean, by 12 weeks, you can start to see children turn on their side. Maybe by about 28 weeks, they're sitting up. 32 weeks, 36 weeks, they're crawling. Maybe by about 48 weeks, they're standing up, somewhere around there. But by about, around here, around 68, 72, about a year or so, maybe less, maybe more, depending on the child, they should be up fully walking. And at that point, it's all hands on deck. Parents, your whole life has changed when your children go from being immobile to mobile. For one, you don't have to carry them anymore, so I'm sure that's a positive. And two, it's just probably a lot more keeping track of them because they can move around everywhere, and boy, do they move. don't have children at the moment. I have younger siblings that I was old enough to help kind of raise and watch grow up. So that's kind of the perspective I'm taking on this. Another thing is that, again, babies, when they're born, they are not born fully formed, especially in their senses. They're really, their eyes aren't very good. Their sense of hearing is still developing, but they're still developing their senses even after birth. I mean, they can start to they can start to see the development of their sense of vision even as early as 2 days. By 3 months, they can discriminate between different colors. And really how we know things like what infants have preferences for, because we can monitor and measure things like fixation times, like how long children or infants will look at things, is kind of an indication of what their preference is. And it turns out that babies typically have they have a preference for things that are familiar, specifically for parents, mom or dad. They're going to show much more preference and spend more time fixating on those people and those objects versus, strangers or other random objects. Here is an example of what I mean by 2 months, they kind of show visual preference. I mean, for a person's face versus like words or these random objects and colors, they're spending much more time fixation wise on, a human face versus these other objects. So it really shows that children develop a preference for humans, and especially familiar humans, very early on. Cognitive development, this is just how children are thinking and how they are representing the world. There are a couple of different ideas about this. Piaget has one theory and Vygotsky has another. Kohlberg has another. So I think that's kind of where we're going to go next, and probably for the rest of this video talk about. The first is Piaget, Jean Piaget. Jean Piaget says that children learn about their environment and develop their ability to think through two processes, one called assimilation and another called accommodation. And assimilation is kind of adding things to our existing understanding. We have a schema, which is just a mental representation of how we see the world. And when things kind of fit into that picture, even when we encounter new information, as long as it fits into our current understanding, we assimilate that information. And I'll give you an example in a moment to help illustrate that. Versus accommodation, when we encounter something new that isn't quite fitting in with our understanding or our worldview, we engage in a process of accommodation where we come up with new schemas, or we transform the way we think to develop new understanding. So let's say a child at home has a dog and they have this schema of the world and understanding that, animals with 4 legs and a fluffy furry tail, and they're furry all over their bodies, this is a dog, or the child might even call it a doggy. And when they go over to grandma and grandpa's house and they see another dog, they assimilate that into their current understanding. Oh, that's a doggy. Yeah, grandma and grandpa has a doggy too. But let's say they go over to their aunt and uncle's house who has a cat. Well, by our current understanding, the cat has a tail, the cat is furry, the cat has 4 legs, so therefore the cat should be a doggy too, right? Well, no, mom and dad says, no, this is actually a kitty cat. This is a cat, not a doggy. There's 2 different kinds of animals. So then at that point, the child has to accommodate this new information that not all animals that have 4 legs and are furry and have tails are doggies or dogs. Some of them are going to be cats. Some of them might be something else too. And this is kind of this process that Piaget is outlining in his theory of development. And he talks about development in terms of stages. According to Piaget, development takes place in 4 stages. The first is called the sensorimotor stage, where children are really learning how to understand the world and to think using their sensory and motor experiences through their movement and sensory information. Basically, and if you have children yourself, if you have younger siblings, you can see this yourself. Children will explore the world literally by putting things in their mouth. They pick anything they can fit into. That's kind of how they develop their understanding really early on. Is, oh, does this fit in my mouth or not? So they're really just trying to figure out the world. They don't have the sense of language yet, so this is how they have the ability to figure out the world. It's not until they use language that things become a little easier. Infants also show what's known as object permanence by around the age of 8 to 12 months, meaning, before 8 to 12 months, if something is out of sight, it is literally out of mind to some children. Like, you can hide something behind your back, and the child may think, oh my gosh, it's gone forever. I don't know where it went. But that's actually not the case. Later on, they kind of figure out, oh, that didn't disappear. You literally just hit it behind your back. This is why peekaboo is really fun for infants at a certain age, and after another age, they don't really care anymore. So it's not that they don't find you humorous anymore; they just kind of pick up on the trick. So here's an example of object permanence. This is a really young infant. At first, hey, show them this blue monkey, then we cover it up, and then hey, where'd the monkey go? It's out of sight. This child has no idea. They're kind of wondering what the heck is going on. Okay, so truth or fiction? Prior to 6 months or so of age, out of sight is literally out of mind. We just talked about this, so hopefully you know the answer. Pause the video. What do you think? Okay, welcome back. It is in fact true. Object permanence. It takes about 6 months or so for children to pick up on this little trick. The next stage, preoperational. This is when children start to use language and they can start thinking in terms of language. They can start thinking about things in terms of the past and present. They might even engage in egocentric thinking, really self-centered thinking at the time. They really have a tough time taking other people's perspectives, but this kind of ties back to brain development. There's still, parts of their brain, their ability to think abstractly and think deeply are not quite there yet. They might also engage in animism and artificialism, basically applying human-like qualities to animals or to things that aren't real or non existing objects. And they also struggle with this idea of conservation, which we'll talk about in a moment. I'll show you an example of in a moment. And in moral judgment, again, they tend to be much more one-dimensional in terms of their morality. They're more likely to think about morality in terms of the consequence. Like, I shouldn't be bad. I should obey the rules so I avoid punishment. That's really the big thing, is just avoiding punishment. At this point, it's not about being good or bad. It's kind of like, I don't want to get in trouble. It's very egocentric. I want to avoid getting in trouble. So here's some examples of like egocentric thought. Whenever you ask a child something like, oh, why is it dark out? Well, the child might say, well, so I can go to sleep. The world revolves around them. It goes dark so I can go to sleep. Animism. Why do trees have leaves? Well, to keep them warm, thinking that, trees are like humans. They need to be warm or cold, which is not totally wrong, but it's probably not the reason why they have leaves. Artificialism, what makes it rain? Somebody emptying a water can, maybe God or somebody, some creature in the sky, a water can. This is kind of the thinking that's going on at this stage. So they are thinking, they're using language, but it's not fully formed yet. And this is what I mean by conservation. At a certain point, at a young age, children really struggle with conservation. If you show them, in picture A, you show them, hey, we have these two things of liquid. They can recognize that they are the same. But before a certain age, especially when they're toddlers or really young children, if you pour one of these liquids into a taller glass, they might think because this is taller, it contains more liquid than the other container, even though they just saw, hey, they're the same liquid, but the physical representation changes the way they see this object, and it's hard for them to understand that just because the way it looks changes, the physical properties haven't changed. Here we go. Truth or fiction? Because mommy wants me to maybe a perfectly good explanation for a 3-year-old. Sorry, it took me a sec to read that. Pause the video. What do you think? Truth or fiction? It is in fact true. Yeah, that is kind of their whole idea of morality is, hey, my mom wants me to be a good person. I don't want to get a spanking, things like that. They're not really thinking about morals quite yet. They're kind of thinking about the direct consequences. More stages, concrete stage. This is when children, this is, around the time that children are going to school, especially middle school. They're starting to show the ability to do logic. They're better at the problem of conservation. They're starting to think about morals in terms of other people. So their thinking is definitely developing, but it's not quite fully formed yet. They're not quite capable of abstract thinking just quite yet. That's not until later on. So anyways, these are the first 3 stages of Piaget. I think we're going to cover stage 4 later on, so hold that thought. Some of the evaluations of Piaget, some criticism is that, well, Piaget probably underestimated children. In fact, children actually show the ability to perform object permanence a little bit sooner than Piaget actually estimated. And really, it may not be so stage-like stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It's kind of more like a gradual slope is kind of what we think about. And then these sequences typically do not vary, although there's still some debate about that. But anyways, Piaget is a really interesting theory that's still talked about widely today, but it is, it's not perfect and has some criticisms. Vygotsky is also sort of in the same vein as a cognitive theorist like Piaget. However, the crux of his theory goes back to social interaction, is that cognition and the way we think develops through social interaction, specifically the interactions that children have with adults or experts have with novices. That's how we develop, by bridging those gaps between kind of what we know on our own and what we need help with. This is known as the zone of proximal development. Zone of proximal development is kind of this gap between what you can do on your own and what you can do with the help of somebody else. And through the use of scaffolding in teaching, instructional devices, you can help bridge that gap. And this is the whole point. Vygotsky said this is all that's going on between children and parents, novices and experts, teachers and students. This is how we learn. This is how we grow, through social interaction. This is one of the last theories that we're going to talk about, but it's Lawrence Kohlberg's moral development. How do morals develop? And it just kind of really syncs up well with Piaget's theory of cognitive development. He breaks it down, or Lawrence Kohlberg breaks morality down into kind of 3 broad stages, followed up by 6 sort of sub-stages. And the pre-conventional level is kind of what we talked about with children at Piaget's second stage. Morality is all about the consequences of behavior. Good behavior is what is obedient, and bad behavior is what is punished. Or good behavior is kind of what allows us to satisfy our needs and maybe help the needs of others. So it's really thinking just simply about the consequences. Conventional level, kind of stages 3 and 4, you start to think about social standards. You start to think about right and wrong in terms of the bigger picture of society. So now we're starting to take other people into consideration, where this idea of social order starts to come into play. The post-conventional level, the final level, and this is where we started getting into things like rights, like human rights, and getting into some really abstract ideas and the ideas of, just and unjust laws. So morality changes very differently from each stage. And this, again, reflects also changes in cognition. I think we're actually going to stop here in just a moment. I want to stop before we get to Erik Erikson. I want to stop at Kohlberg. Some evidence, there are some criticisms of Kohlberg. For one, the idea is that Kohlberg mostly thought about morality from a male perspective. He kind of ignored the female perspective, and others have kind of talked about a care versus justice approach to morality that might differ, not so much on gender lines like we used to think, but kind of depending on the situation. But anyways, Kohlberg kind of leaves some really important meat on the bone in terms of like where morality comes from. He kind of leaves out things like gender, culture, education, things like that, and how that influences our morality. And also, again, not everybody reaches this last stage, this post-conventional stage, because we're talking about some pretty abstract thinking that you have to be capable of. Thinking about justice and rights and human rights and things like that. Those are pretty abstract ideas. And if not everybody is capable of thinking that deeply. So you have to be able to think that way in order to achieve this kind of thinking. So we're going to stop here because I want to jump into Erikson, but I don't want to do it until the next video. So this is kind of halfway through the chapter. We're going to stop here. We'll pick up with Erikson on the next part. So stay tuned, and we'll pick up with Erik Erikson. Thank you very much.